Hello and welcome to Gladys Cake Kitchen. My name is Gladys, baker and cake artist, and over here I make simple, informative tutorials to help you navigate cake decorating easily, as well as hand you practical and useful tips to help you level up your baking and decorating skills. So if you're new here, hello and welcome. And if you've been here before, hello again and welcome back. It's a pleasure to have you all, and I hope you find some value in today's video because we're talking all things cake. We'll be touching on various subjects in cake decorating, from why you should add sugar syrup to your cakes, to trimming, crumb coating and covering your cake with ganache. The subject of today's discussion is an 80th themed birthday cake that I made and created into a tutorial. The full tutorial is linked up here for you to check out. But in this video, I employed a few different techniques to achieve the result of a beautiful, well-presented cake. And whilst the cake is beautifully presented, I had some challenges throughout the decorating process as well as the finishing aspects of the cake. So in this video, I'll be breaking down some of the challenges I had, why they came to be, how I fixed them, as well as handing you foolproof techniques on how to solve your cake decorating problems when they do arise on your decorating days. With that in mind, a little bit of background information about these sit-down videos. Like most of my videos that are created into tutorials, I have one objective in mind: to deliver useful information in a very succinct way so that I can keep your attention. As a result of this objective, some of the information that I could have elaborated on, giving you more information, gets left during editing. And this 80th themed birthday cake was no different. So I thought I'd create some sit-down videos bringing you some more information to follow up on these tutorials, where I unpick some of the techniques and hand you some more detailed information surrounding why I use various techniques and how they came to give me the result of a beautifully presented cake. By so doing, you get behind the scenes of the cake decorating process with me and get a bit more information, probably as added value to these tutorials. With that in mind, let's jump right into some of the techniques that were used and the processes, and I'll talk you through some of those. So firstly, one of the first things I did in this cake tutorial was to add sugar syrup to my cake layers. Sugar syrup is well encouraged in cake decorating, and that is because it adds moisture and enhances the flavor of cake sponges. For me though, while this is a good thing, I normally, if you've seen a few of my videos, skip this process altogether. And the simple reason being, I formulate my own recipes, which means my recipes bake moisture. So I am confident to skip adding sugar syrup to my cake layers altogether. Having said that, it's not just the moisture. Sometimes the time of decorating does leave the cake dry in the process, because some cakes do take a few days from start to finish. However, for me, my decorating process is sometimes 24 to 48 hours max. A day to bake and let the cake settle, and another day to decorate. The cake is picked up probably on the third day and eaten straight away. So the cake is normally not sitting around to get dry. As a result of all these factors, I am always confident to skip adding sugar syrup to my cake layers, but for you that may not be the case. I added some sugar syrup particularly to these cake layers because I was working on a variety of cakes on the day, and this particular cake wasn't going to be decorated for a little while. So I thought, whilst leveling all the cakes, I'll add some sugar syrup so that it can preserve the moisture, so on another day when I came to decorating the cake, they will stay moist throughout the process. Talking about sugar syrup, if you don't know what sugar syrup is simply sugar solution that is made from adding equal parts of sugar to water that is boiled down for the sugar to dissolve, let to cool and flavored accordingly, and used to add moisture to cakes. For the part where it enhances flavor, I tend to add vanilla extract to my sugar syrup, which means the flavor of vanilla is enhanced and intensified on my cake layers when I use sugar syrup on these cake layers. Now, if you're not keen on having extra water dripping over your cake layers or excess sugar on your cake layers, you can thin out your favorite bottle of preserve with boiling water, stir it to the right consistency, leave it to cool, and use it accordingly. The biggest question to answer is whether adding sugar syrup is necessary despite its advantages or not. The answer is either here nor there. For me, sugar syrup has its advantages. For the reasons I've explained earlier, I tend to skip it, but occasionally, as you've seen, I tend to use it for the purpose that it helps me with. For you, if you're confident that your cake will bake moist and you don't need the extra moisture, then you can skip that completely. But as a beginner, a general rule of thumb is always to stick to best practices. So my best recommendation is to stick with the best recommended practice and add some sugar syrup to your cake layers, because a bit of moisture goes a long way to keep your cakes and doesn't hurt the cake at all. Whilst we're at it, be careful though when you do add sugar syrup, because sometimes adding too much moisture to the cakes can leave your cake sponges soggy. You can simply mitigate the water running over your layers by using a pastry brush to dab the sugar syrup onto your cake, or use a squeezy bottle. That's all I have to say about using sugar syrup on your cake. I'll be moving on to filling the cake next. Now let's talk filling the cake. In the tutorial, you'll find I had a little trouble whilst filling the cake, which I eventually fixed. But this trouble was self-inflicted. I'll explain. The cake in the tutorial was filled with soft filling. We had the buttercream and jam. As a general practice, when filling a cake with soft fillings like jam, caramel, and other elements that do not hold themselves, it's important to keep them contained in the cake. So for instance, for jam, a border is to be created, which is also known as a dam, creating a hollow space in the cake and the jam filled into the cake. This allows the buttercream on the outside of the cake to keep the jam locked in and does not leak out. You can do this by using a piping tip to pipe a border, or dig a hole with your offset spatula. Over the years that I have filled cakes, I've developed a simple practice of digging the hole with my offset spatula and putting the jam into the cake. However, on this note, I was in a hurry. Time was not on my side. So when you observe from the tutorial, you'll find that when I layered the second layer of cake over the first layer, there was a little bit of a shift and a slide over there. At this point, I should have scraped the entire buttercream and refilled the cake. But for some reason, I decided to follow through my filling of the cake. Now you'll notice in the tutorial that I did do the rest of the layers right by digging the hole deeper, creating a border and filling the jam in. But this very first mistake at the first layer would come to cost me, because eventually the jam did leak, which I had to fix. So here's a lesson for you. There are recommended practices that you cannot cheat your way through during cake decorating. So from this, the lesson is always to stick to the best recommended practices. Leave yourself enough time to decorate your cake so you are able to observe the practices that will guarantee you best results. And on this note, whilst experience and confidence helped me to fix this easily, as a beginner, it can be tricky when you start having difficult issues during the decorating process. So advisably, it's best to avoid it altogether. Having said that, even though this problem was self-inflicted, in cake decorating, you will find that there are issues that will arise that are out of your control. From soft buttercream on a weather day to shifting layers on a very hot sunny day. These are all issues that may arise, and over time you will learn what works best for you and will use this appropriately to help you. So by trying to fix this leak in the cake, I ended up having to trim the cake down for a clean surface, digging into the leak, exposing it and covering it in a layer of ganache. And after several layers, the leak was nowhere to be found. Between the tutorial itself that touches on how I fixed this leak, I have created some shorts videos elaborating on this as well. So this is additional information on how the leak came to be, what you can do to avoid such problems when they do arise, and eventually how I fixed them. The next subject post filling is trimming down the cake. If you've been on this channel before, you'll find that I tend to trim all my cakes. And whilst there's good reason for that, there's more to it that meets the eye. For me, trimming is a preferred option to give me a clean slice when the cake is cut into. Normally, when I see a cake slice that has the brown crusty bits on the side, it tends to give it a bit of a thumbs down. But outside my own preferences, trimming has several advantages that will help you achieve better results during your cake decorating process. For instance, when you have an uneven cake, trimming down the cake allows you to have an even surface, giving you a clear cake to work with. But with these advantages, not all cakes need to be trimmed. I have made cakes that are incredibly tall, and sometimes trimming them can be a little bit shifty and can unsettle the cake. So for that, my need to have a clean cake when sliced into is lower than having a shifting cake 11 inches tall that may be problematic when I come to trimming it. So I have completely disregarded trimming, and the cake has turned out fine. Sometimes also trimming works against you, especially if it is going to deform the shape of the cake that needs to be trimmed. For instance, for a football cake that relies on a perfect sphere for a good looking football cake, it's important to keep its shape, and thereby trimming this cake might deform the sphere. So as a result, for cakes that require their shape to stay, trimming can be disregarded and may be considered for other cakes. So essentially for trimming, I take it on a case by case basis. One of the things you can do to avoid the crusty bits on your cake is to use baking strips. I've tried that before, and caramelization hasn't formed on the cake and baked perfectly, a yellow looking tender sponge that doesn't require trimming. However, I tend to bake a lot of cakes over a certain period and bake in large batches. So having to use baking strip for all these bakes can be time consuming and slightly expensive. Even if I did decide to go via the DIY route, that was still going to cost me in terms of making these strips and covering the cakes with them. So as a result, I choose to bake my cakes with the caramelization and trim them down during the decorating process, and that's much an easier way of doing things. So a few tips to adhere to get best result from trimming is to make sure that your cake is firm when you come to trimming the cake. For me, normally after filling the cake, I leave it in the fridge for up to 30 minutes, and in this tutorial I did the same, and the cake sets firm and is firm to touch. The cake is brought back and then trimmed to avoid shifting layers. For best results, dip the blade of your knife in hot water. Ensure the blade is equally sharp. It gives you a clean cut to the cake without having to saw through the sides of the cake, because you're aiming for an even, well trimmed cake. Next is crumb coating. Crumb coating is the practice of applying a thin layer of ganache or buttercream on a cake to seal in the crumbs. This allows all the crumbs to be kept together so they don't seep through the subsequent layers of buttercream or ganache that are used for the cakes. In the end, you end up with a very polished look to your semi-naked or ganache cake. For me, crumb coating is usually a must, simply because I trim my cakes, thereby creating a lot of crumbs that needs to be kept sealed together. And for this ATF themed cake, after crumb coating, I followed up with subsequent layers of ganache, I think about 2 or 3, eventually ending up with my pink colored cake. With that said, on this channel, you'll find that some of my crumb coating will start with a different color, and then eventually the cake is finished off with a completely different color. In between, sometimes I use plain colored white chocolate ganache. When you color ganache and you run out, it's difficult to sometimes get the right color to match the existing color that has been made. So as a rule of thumb, it's better to have more ganache to work with than less. So because of that, I tend to have excess colored ganache that are left over. I scrape this all together, and as a means to reuse and not waste them, I crumb coat the cake with those. The cake was eventually covered as a polished pink stenciled ganache cake, which was transferred from the cake surface to a fondant covered cake board. And that takes me to the subject of cake cards underneath a stack of cake. Talking about a cake card underneath a stack of cake, this is a simple recommended practice for good reason. In a lot of my tutorials featured on this channel, you'll find that when I'm layering a cake, normally I have a cake board on which I apply ganache and place a cake card on that. The ganache serves as glue to hold the cake card onto the cake board. The cake board becomes my work surface, and the cake card becomes a base over which the cake layers are laid. What you don't see on camera is that the cake card on the cake board held with ganache is left to set and chill. A little layer of ganache is applied before the first layer of cake is held onto the cake card. This can be left to chill, to set, before the subsequent layers are held together. For you to get a straight standing cake starts at observing these processes diligently. And I do that, but it's such a repetitive process that sometimes in some video I have captured well, and in some videos I have skipped. Know that if you're going to follow this process, first of all, layer the cake card or cake circle on a cake drum, leave it to set, come back, place some ganache or buttercream on the cake card. Place your first layer, leave that to set before you come back to filling your cake completely. If you're a beginner, these are the processes that I would recommend you observe, so when filling a cake you can set it up properly. I see a few videos online that do not use cake cards underneath the cakes, and for this I'm not saying it's a right or a wrong thing. For most of those cakes that I have observed online, you will find that those cakes do not get moved from the work surface. They are worked on the surface, decorated on there, and left as that, sometimes on a foil covered cake drum or the maisonette ones. Generally, as best practice, I tend to transfer my cakes from work surface onto another fondant covered board where the cake is finally displayed. So as a result, for me, the first thing a cake card does is that it seals the cake in and does not expose the cake, which makes it convenient for transfer and for handling as well. Because for transferring the cake, I tend to slip a knife underneath the cake and lift it up. I would hate for a knife to poke into the cake. And also from one surface to the other, it's much easier and perhaps food safe that the cake card seals the cake from exposure, making it easy for transferring as well. An additional reason for having cake circles underneath the cake is that combined with dowels, they tend to break the weight of one cake over another when you're tearing the cakes. So that is also another thing to consider. Another optional thing that I have found has become very useful for me is that because I trim my cakes, when I trim my cakes, the cake circle becomes my guide, that a small gap is left between the cake card and the cake. And into this small gap is when I fill the ganache. The cake card will then become my guide for when I come to scraping the cake, giving me a clean, well-presented, formed cake. With all that explanation, do you like cake cards or cake circles, and what are your preferences? For me, that is also how I was taught. So I tend to stick with the practices that have served me well, and that is what I bring to my videos. Cake circles done. The next thing to cake circles is cake boards. There's quite a range of those on the market, and cake boards are probably an underrated material in cake decorating. They are not spoken about a lot, but I find them super useful because I use cake boards as my work surface over which my cake is decorated and then transferred into a fondant covered cake board. Now I tend to use a fondant covered board with a ribbon base because I want my cakes to have a presentable professional look when they are displayed. But what's your preference? Sometimes you have a yellow or orange looking foil covered board with a sloppy cake that is sitting on it. There's nothing more garish and hurts my eye than looking at that. But that's not having a go at anyone who has done this. We all start from somewhere. But a good tip for a better presentation of your cake is to consider how your board is presented. A little bit of fondant over the board and a ribbon on the trim, and setting your cake up nicely will give you a better outcome for your cake presentation. The cake after transfer had some piped elements of buttercream on it. Whilst most of my cakes are covered in ganache, for piping elements I do tend to use buttercream where necessary. This buttercream I thinned out again with some white food coloring and ended up having a lightly colored buttercream which was used for the piping on this cake. For decorative elements, I chose simple artificial flowers. Artificial flowers are a very simplistic way of adding floral additions to your cake without the hassle that comes like using fresh flowers, which has to be prepared right. We know sugar flowers are very difficult and technical to make. Artificial flowers tend to bridge the gap for both, even though they still need to be prepared and made food safe. A good tip is to spray your artificial flowers with a bit of vinegar and throw them in an oven at 50 degrees fan for 20 minutes and bring them out, let them cool, and stick them onto the cake. For me, the simple practice of sticking them onto the cake requires having to snip every stalk or metal on the cake and place a toothpick in its place. This is my way of creating a food safety barrier between the cake and the flowers. The most significant decorative item that completed this cake was a fondant cup and saucer. The cake was supposed to be a high tea themed cake with an element of a cup and saucer. But what you did not see on camera is that my first attempts to create the teacup did not go well. The first time I attempted to make the teacup, I tried to use a different means by using a tub. I had added too much Tylose powder to my fondant. Tylose powder is a drying agent that helps fondant elements dry and set hard. I added too much to my fondant, which means the fondant was stiff. So molding it on this plastic tub didn't seem to take form, and the fondant tore a lot. Frustrated, I gave up on it and decided to shift to another option, using an actual teacup and a saucer as my mold. Yet again, the problem I had with that was hard for me to tease out some of the folds that had formed in the teacup. I did try my best, but eventually, as you would see in the tutorial, there were slight imperfections that I was able to cover well, thereby still presenting me with a beautiful cake. Now, the reason why I left such imperfection and mistakes in my tutorial is to teach and inform you. There are things that will work for you and against you during cake decorating. And whilst the aim is always to be able to present the best work, there are days that may not be possible, or at least sometimes you just have to take an L and get on with it. But as you've observed in the tutorial, when I came to even painting the cup, my hand was shaky. I have shaky hands, so painting intricate small details on a cake can be difficult for me to do sometimes. Given the option, this wouldn't have been the cup I would have settled for. I wanted some little dainty flowers showing on the cake, but with my shaky hands, I was scared I would end up making a sloppy cup, so left it as a plain teacup with a gold rim and a saucer to match. The customer eventually was happy with their cake, left a very positive feedback, and sent me a goodwill message to thank me. I can't tell you the number of cakes that I've been very self-critical of myself, sitting and wondering how I botched the cake and how imperfect it was and how unhappy a customer would feel, only for the customer to turn around and say, look, I loved my cake and it was amazing. And from that customer has come several recommendations. The subject of this discussion in the form of the tutorial is linked right here on screen for you to watch. If you have further questions or suggestions of videos you want me to elaborate on, I'll be happy to do that, but leave them in the comment section. I'll be back in my next video. Thanks for watching.